Viking warrior versus Anglo-Saxon warrior. Who would win a flawless victory or just a fair battle? Let's see who actually mastered the medieval metagame. Ready, set. Let's start with mobility, the absolute backbone of any good asymmetric campaign. The Vikings possessed the ultimate piece of 9th century criminal infrastructure, the longship. These things were a marvel of naval engineering. They had a shallow draft, meaning they could cross the brutal North Sea and then sail straight up shallow British rivers, catching inland monasteries completely off guard. It was essentially Uber for raiders. Now, look at the Anglo-Saxon response under Alfred the Great. Eventually, they built the Burghal Hidage, a brilliant system of fortified towns, or burghs, spaced a day's march apart. Strategically, genius. Logistically, it turned the British military into an administrative bureaucracy. Soldiers became glorified security guards waiting by a wall, praying the draft paperwork went through, before the raiders burned the next parish down. The Anglo-Saxons were playing defense in slow motion, while the Vikings were running a high-speed corporate restructuring program by force. Pop culture says every Viking carried a magnificent, professionally forged iron sword. Reality check. Iron was expensive. Most Viking grunts carried a bearded axe, literally a woodworking tool adapted to crack skulls, because it was cost-effective. It's the rapier of the poor. They paired this with a simple round shield. The Anglo-Saxons, on the other hand, relied heavily on the classic Scyldburh, the shield wall. When deployed correctly by the Fyrd, the local militia, and the nobility, it was a massive heavy wall of overlapping oak and lime wood, bristling with spears. It was defensive collective bargaining at its finest. The problem, a shield wall is only as strong as the most terrified guy in the front row. If one peasant broke rank to save his own skin, the entire formation unzipped like a cheap jacket, leaving everyone vulnerable to a flock of axes. Now for the fan favorites, the heavy hitters. In the blue corner, we have the legendary Viking Berserkers. Modern media loves portraying them as unstoppable demigods. In reality, they were likely a small cult of hyper-religious zealots who choked down hallucinogenic mushrooms or worked themselves into a hysterical adrenaline-fueled rage. They fought naked or in animal skins, screaming at the top of their lungs. Terrifying, yes. Reliable, absolutely not. You can't run an empire on a military strategy that relies on your frontline troops having a bad drug trip and forgetting where their pants are. In the red corner, we have the Anglo-Saxon Housecarls. These were professional, full-time, heavily armored elite mercenaries and bodyguards to the king or earls. They wore top-tier chainmail, carried devastating two-handed axes, and most importantly, they were sober, highly disciplined, and paid regularly from land revenues. They were institutional violence, perfected. Let's talk economics, because wars are won in the treasury, not just the trenches. Why did the Vikings leave Scandinavia? Because the soil was terrible, agriculture was a nightmare, and the local chieftains were locked in a brutal survival of the fittest loop. They were starved for capital, crying over a lack of resources. They realized England was essentially a giant, unprotected piggy bank, full of wealthy, undefended monasteries. They had the ultimate motivation: migrate and steal, or starve. And how did the British kingdoms handle this economic threat? Enter the Danegeld. Instead of using their massive agricultural wealth to build a permanent standing army, the Anglo-Saxon rulers thought it would be a brilliant idea to just pay the Vikings to go away. Spoiler alert. Extortionists do not retire after the first payment. Every time a Saxon king collected a heavy tax from his own peasants to pay off a Viking fleet, the Vikings just used that exact gold to fund a larger fleet for the next season. It was the medieval equivalent of trying to cure a gambling addiction by betting more money. If this were a standard, polite medieval war, the Anglo-Saxons would have wrapped it up quickly. They loved a traditional, formal pitch battle. Two armies meet on a hill, yell at each other, clash shields, and the winner takes the field. Very noble, very organized, very useless against an enemy playing guerrilla warfare. The Vikings completely rejected the feudal rulebook. They didn't want to fight the king's main army. They wanted to hit a wealthy target, grab the silver, enslave the locals, and vanish back into the fog before the local militia could even finish putting on their boots. If they were cornered, they would rapidly seize a church or a fortified position, use it as a tactical base, and force the Saxons into a costly siege. They were masters of asymmetric warfare. completely exposing the rigid, slow-moving nature of early British feudal defense. Psychology is everything in power scaling. Let's look at the ideological software running inside these warriors' heads. The Norsemen had Valhalla. If you die with a weapon in your hand, you get escorted by Valkyries to an eternal frat party hosted by Odin, where you fight all day and drink mead all night. It was the ultimate foolproof life insurance policy for a violent society. Death wasn't a tragedy, it was a promotion. Now look at the Anglo-Saxons. They were deeply, profoundly Christian, which should have given them a moral edge. But the institutional church at the time had a terrible habit of interpreting disasters through a lens of collective guilt. When the Vikings sacked Lindisfarne, the prominent clerics didn't say, "Hey, let's build better fortresses." They said, "This is the wrath of God punishing us for our sins." Imagine being a Saxon infantryman, standing in a freezing shield wall, looking at a horde of screaming, axe-wielding Northmen, while your own priest is whispering in your ear that the guys trying to kill you might actually be executing God's holy will. Talk about a devastating debuff to your frontline morale. People often picture the Vikings as isolated barbarians who randomly stumbled onto British shores. That is an insult to their intelligence network. The Vikings were globalized merchants long before they were conquerors. Their trade routes stretched from the frozen fjords, all the way to Baghdad and Constantinople. They knew exactly who held power, who was weak, and where the liquidity was stored. When they arrived in Britain, they didn't just attack blindly. They masterfully exploited the bitter, petty civil wars between the rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia. They played the role of political kingmakers, backing one local lord against another, until everyone was too weak to resist. Meanwhile, the Anglo-Saxon elite were trapped in absolute parochialism. They were so busy stabbing each other in the back for the title of Bretwalda, that they treated their neighboring British kingdoms as bigger threats than the actual foreign invasion fleets parked in their estuaries. They didn't have an international perspective, they had a backyard squabble. But here is the final, brutal twist of historical power scaling. The long game. The Viking meta was perfect for raiding, but it carried the seeds of its own destruction. In 865 they stopped sending small raiding parties, and brought over the great heathen army to conquer and settle. And guess what happens when nomadic raiders finally get exactly what they wanted? Land. They turn into the very thing they used to hate: settled, predictable, boring farmers. They had to worry about crop yields, tax collection, and defending their borders from other Vikings. Within a few generations, the Norse elite in Danelaw were adopting local customs, converting to Christianity, and getting comfortably assimilated. And Britain? The existential dread of total annihilation did something incredible. It forced the surviving kingdom of Wessex, under Alfred and his brilliant descendants like Edward the Elder and Athelstan, to completely reinvent their society. They centralized the economy, standardized the military, built a permanent navy, and unified the fractured, bickering sub-kingdoms into a single, hyper-focused, structurally resilient state, the Kingdom of England. That's my breakdown. Disagree with the scoring? Think the Berserkers got robbed? Let me know in the comments, and go ahead. I'm Cardboard Guy, and I'm going back to my box. Stay sharp, stay cynical, and see you next time.